Hey guys, roughly a year or so ago, I put a post on Facebook asking if people would be interested in hearing about my experience working in correctional food service for 7 years. And a lot of people did seem pretty interested to hear about it. I'm sorry it's taken over a year to get around to, but life happens and whatnot, so figured go ahead and make it. So I'll start off with how I got introduced into the industry. I was working at a hash brown factory, and one of my coworkers and good friends had got an opportunity from a friend of hers to work at Clay County Jail in their kitchen. They had shifted from in-house food service, so county employees, county buying the food and everything else, to contract, which they hired another company to come in and take care of all that for them. So when that happened, all of the employees except for one stayed with the county, whether it was a guard or an admin or something of that sort. That one, her name was Elizabeth, call her Liz, and so she had no employees. So Taylor told me about the opportunity, and Taylor, myself, and a couple other guys applied and got jobs there. So in my interview, the district manager for the company was very adamant about me going in and just kind of feeling what it was like to be in a jail, because no matter who your work, no matter your capacity in the jail, we're all locked in there. So I went, and I didn't have an issue with it. I accepted the job, and going into that, my view on incarcerated people was not the highest. You could say I looked down on them to some degree. I had met and known a couple people who had been incarcerated in my life, and they all were kind of similar. Poor background, couldn't really trust them, slightly shady people, but for the most part, decent people. So as time went on, I got to know everybody, all the inmates that I worked with. So typically in jails, the inmate workers are called trustees, and depending on the size of the facility, typically depends on the amount of trustees you get. At Clay County, we served roughly 360 people, so we had anywhere from 10 to 13 inmate workers, trustees, at a time. They would do things like dishes, help serve on the line, they would run carts up, they would clean, do cooking to some degree, not all of it. But I worked, these guys were my co-workers, and sitting and talking with them, it really humanized incarcerated people for me, because so many of them were just people who were mentally ill. 99% of them were addicts to some degree, and prior to me working in that environment, I really didn't have any sympathy for addicts. I'm not really an addict myself, so I never knew I don't know what it's like, but I was always pretty hard on addicts. I just kind of chalked them up to, they're just wanting to get high or drunk, or they don't care about anybody else. But over time, I learned that there's a lot more to it than that. And I was very lucky to be raised the way that I was by my mom and dad, to always treat everybody with respect and kindness, but also don't allow yourself to be ran over by anybody, which is very easy to do whenever you're working in that environment. You know, you're surrounded by criminals, and you know, they're mean looking, they're missing a bunch of teeth, they're yada yada yada. So because of my upbringing, I was able to navigate conversation situations with trustees very well. I was 20. I was 21 whenever I got hired, and you know, very just 21-year-old kid essentially. And I think that kind of worked to my advantage to some degree, because whenever I would talk to these guys, they could see that I wasn't, when I would ask questions, I wasn't trying to pry or intrude. It was genuine, innocent curiosity. And that led to most inmate conversations being pretty genuine. You know, I was at Clay County for a year and a half, and whenever you have 12 to 13 inmate workers in your kitchen at all times, it was a revolving door of people. You know, I'm not saying all inmates are great people. I also only dealt with the lower level offenders. Those were the only ones eligible to be in the trustee program. But you know, it's a big point of this video is to try to get people to see someone who has been incarcerated just as a person, not necessarily a criminal. But you know, over time, you know, and I respected, I guess, the code, you know, call it the inmate code, criminal code, whatever, of, you know, not just asking direct questions, kind of handling situations with grace and respect. And like I said, that really took me through my 7-year career. And more of those guys would kind of start talking to me about some of their deeper stuff. You know, I had the one story that sticks out to me that I'll never forget was I had this trustee. He was kind of a little bit of a troublemaker, a little of a drama starter. I don't know. He just kind of what you would expect out of an inmate. He was a meth addict, had been for over a decade, stolen who knows how many cars, hurt a couple people, I would assume. He'd been in prison. And I guess one side note, jail is the in-between of freedom. Well, that's a wrong word to say. Being outside of incarceration. Well, that's not even a good way to put it. Jail is where you go before you're sentenced. Once a sentence is handed down, if you are sentenced to any amount of time outside of county time, if you're sentenced to any state crime, then you go to prison. So that's the difference between jail and prison. But so this particular inmate, he had been to prison. He had been through it. Looked worse for the wear. But over time, you know, working next to him and just always treating him with basic dignity and respect, had got to talking. And due to my being kind of young and naive, I just kind of straight up asked him, I was like, how do you get how do you get on meth? How did you find it? And he told me one of the shortest, most heartbreaking stories I have ever heard, especially now that I'm a dad. He said one day, whenever he was 12 years old, he had gotten off early from school, and his dad didn't realize he was coming home early. So he walks in the door, and his dad's sitting on the couch, and he had 3 lines on the table, chopped up lines. And he said, "Dad, what's that?" And he said, "Red and black methamphetamines. You want some?" And then proceeded to have his son snort meth with him. The moment I heard that story, my entire view of him changed. Especially as a dad now, I cannot fathom a universe where that makes any sense. And that's not the only story like that I've heard. That was one of the first ones and the ones that hit me the hardest. But I don't know. It really messed me up. So from that point on, I kind of made it a point to try and see where a lot of these guys' addiction was rooted. And, some of it's genetic, a lot of it's trauma, a lot of it's horrible parenting. And some of it started in childhood. I had one, this guy was very intelligent. He had broken his arm as a young kid in the early 2000s. Gets into the hospital, cast, whole 9, and they prescribed him OxyContin as either preteen or early teenager. There were no tapering off instructions. He kind of, he ran out of pills and his prescription was up, and then he started going through withdrawals. Friends at school had pills, yada yada yada. Lifelong addict. I mean, it was that just broken arm changed the course of his entire life. And a lot of it is pain, emotional pain. I had one guy, he was a chef. He was an instructor at the Platte County, I forget what it's called now, but the trade school in Platte City. He developed their culinary program. He taught there for a long period of time. He was an executive chef for BNSF Railroad. He fed Warren Buffett and several former presidents. He was a sushi chef. Very accomplished. Had a family. Lived in a very nice neighborhood. And on the day of his mother's funeral, his wife and his best friend came to him and told him that they had been secretly having an affair for a couple of years, and that she was leaving him for his best friend. And this guy, he articulated kind of why he went the way he did very well. He said he had no coping skills. Growing up, those were not instilled in him. And the fact that he was losing his wife the day that he was burying his mom was just too much for him, and he said he just wanted to not feel anymore. There's nothing, all of these people are adults and they make their own decisions. I'm not making excuses for these people. But I think it's so important to handle these situations with grace. And not look down on anybody, because one thing that I also heard early on in my career there in the correctional food industry was we're all one step away from being in there. At one of the units I worked at, there was a guy who, he had really wide tires and he was on a 2-lane road. His tires went over the center line, got a ticket. He forgot about it. They showed up with a warrant, arrested him, and he spent 3 months in jail for an unpaid ticket. I mean, my mom, I rolled a car in high school and a parking ticket was in the glove box. They forgot about it. And while I was going to take the ACT, Caldwell County Sheriff's Department showed up at my house and arrested my mom. Took her to, booked her. My dad was right behind her, so he immediately bonded her out. But she had a hearing in front of the judge, and, but not everybody has the luxury of having someone right there, Had my mom been by herself, or the judge decided to not hear the case that day, or, so many different things. Who knows? She could have spent 3 or 4 days for a parking ticket. So, these, again, I'm not giving people in jail a pass by any stretch of the imagination, but I really think it's important that, we try to remember that these are people. And I had negative interactions with trustees. I had one young kid. He was 18. He was in Northeast Kansas City. Bad neighborhood where he grew up. Didn't really have much of a mom or a dad. He had gotten arrested shortly after he was smoking meth on someone's front porch, and the person came out and told him to get out of here. And he said okay, and then proceeded to continue to try to smoke meth on his porch. So the guy kicked him in the face and broke his jaw. He showed up at Clay County, his jaw healed up, and he became a trustee. And there's a term in the meth community called permatweak, and where it doesn't matter if they're high or not, they're kind of gone. Their brain's fried. There's not some serious damage has been done. And that's about where this young man was. And someone like him, he probably needed some sort of mental facility. He probably needed to undergo some pretty intense psychological treatment. And he never, to my knowledge, he never really got much better. I'd have a conversation with him. I'd, always treat him with respect, but I also, he wanted to be a man, so I also treated him like a man. Spoke very direct with him. I did not mince words. I very rarely minced words with inmates, trustees, however you want to put it. And he, in the conversation, he'd be there, and 5 minutes later, it's like it never happened. I also had another young man in there who he watched his mom die in front of him from an overdose. His dad worked a lot. He got in with the wrong crowds. Him and this young man was also 18. Him and some of his friends were pretty deep into the drug scene. They had, I believe, essentially kidnapped a dealer, fairly well known and well liked person in that community. All of the details are kind of shady. I've heard mixed stories from several different sources, but the long and short of it is this individual passed away from physical injuries he sustained. And because this particular trustee that I had was attached to it, he had a target on him. And he, because of the world that he lived in and operated in, he would kind of openly brag about his history. I remember he would tell some of the older guys who had possession charges or just more minor charges, catch a real charge, pussy, shit like that. But also, there were times where I would find him in a corner bawling his eyes out. I never pressed about his involvement in the death of that individual. All I told him was, dude, you need to get it together, and as soon as you're out of here, you need to go. Yeah, like, go far away. You can't be around here, whether it's because you'll fall back into your drug use or someone's going to hurt you. And lo and behold, he was out for maybe 2 months, and they found him dead on a porch. And that he was a kid, 18, 19, and as much trouble as that individual gave me, he was probably the single most difficult, one of the two most difficult trustees I had ever interacted with. It really broke my heart. That's, you never want to hear that. So, it's a different world that they operate in. And on the flip side of that, the guards, they have a very difficult job, and I do not think the system helps them out much either. Our justice system is completely flawed and broken. There is absolutely no doubt about it. And because of that, it's a trickle-down effect. The detention officers, they have a very difficult job. In my year and a half at Clay County, there were, I believe, 3 suicides and at least 1 murder in that building. These are regular people that respond to these things. Some of them don't have any background. Any 21-year-old can go be a civilian detention officer if you got a clean background and pass a drug test. And that's a lot of trauma for someone to witness and go through, for someone who's just going to work for not a whole lot of money. And, I know there are programs in place to help them work through those things, through their trauma and the things they witnessed. And, Platte County was really good about whenever something like that would happen, that they would check on them and, evaluate them and really make sure that they were doing as okay as they could be. But, they have a really difficult job, and it makes them, the trauma that they see in the culture in the law enforcement community, a lot of it's suck it up, this is your job. And some of it's just becoming jaded and callous. I can't tell you the amount of good people I've seen just kind of their eyes glass over and they just check out because of the stuff that they have had to do and see. It's sad. Jail's not a great place for anybody. Jail has saved some people. They were knocking on death's door and they got arrested. And then they got their shit together, got sober, reconnected with their family while they were in jail. Jail serves a purpose, but there's a lot of things that could be done differently. I'm not saying give them, 5-star amenities by any stretch. It's just none of the root causes of the vast majority of incarcerated people's issues are ever addressed. And it's sad. It really is. But I think that's kind of all I have for now. I do have some other things to talk about. So I'll throw this up, and if it's something that people enjoy or are interested to hear, let me know. I've got 7 years worth of stuff I could talk about. That's kind of just the tip of the iceberg and the long and short of it. So if you guys enjoyed this and would like to hear more, just let me know. Thank you.